January 17th, 1942. The Polish winter pressed against the windows of a Wehrmacht command post in the town of Mir, 30 miles southwest of Minsk. Major Karl Plagge sat alone at his desk, the flame of a kerosene lamp casting long shadows across requisition forms and deployment orders. Outside, the temperature had dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. The wind carried with it something more than cold. It carried the acrid smell of smoke from the direction of the ghetto, where wooden structures had been set ablaze 3 days earlier. Plagge's hands trembled slightly as he signed his name to a document that would, in the bureaucratic language of the Third Reich, authorize the establishment of a labour camp for skilled workers, but the trembling was not from the cold. It was from the weight of what he was about to do, a deception so complete, so carefully constructed, that it would require him to lie to every superior officer, every SS functionary, every Nazi ideologue who crossed his path for the next 3 years. In the distance, the sound of truck engines idled. The Einsatzgruppen had arrived in the region 6 months earlier, and their work had been methodical, thorough, and utterly without mercy. The mobile killing units had moved through the villages and towns of occupied Belarus like a plague, leaving behind mass graves and shattered communities. The Jewish population of Mir had already been reduced from nearly 3,000 to fewer than 800. The survivors huddled in a sealed ghetto waiting for the inevitable. Orders had been issued. The final liquidation of the Mir ghetto was scheduled for August. Every Jew remaining would be executed. Every single one. This was not conjecture. This was not rumour. This was official Reich policy, communicated through proper channels, documented in triplicate, and expected to be carried out with German efficiency. But Major Karl Plagge, a 44-year-old engineer from Darmstadt, holder of the Iron Cross from the First World War, member of the Nazi Party since 1931, had decided that he would not obey. The decision had not come suddenly. It had accumulated slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a river, built up from 1,000 small observations, 1,000 quiet horrors, witnessed over months of occupation duty. Plagge had watched the systematic destruction of human beings transformed into administrative routine. He had seen children herded into trucks. He had heard the reports from officers who spoke of mass shootings with the casual indifference of men discussing crop yields. He had read the directives that used terms like special treatment and resettlement to describe murder on an industrial scale. And somewhere in the accumulation of these horrors, something inside Karl Plagge had broken, or perhaps, more accurately, something had been restored. A moral clarity that ideology had temporarily obscured had returned with absolute certainty. He would resist. He would deceive. He would save as many lives as possible, even if it cost him his own. The lamp flickered. Outside, the trucks continued their idle rumble, waiting to transport workers to the labour camp that Plagge had requisitioned. Workers who, according to the official documentation, possess skills essential to the German war effort. Workers who were, in reality, writers, teachers, children, and elderly men and women who could barely lift a hammer. Workers whose only real qualification was that they were human beings, and Karl Plagge had decided that being human was qualification enough to live. To understand what Karl Plagge did and why he did it, we must first understand who he was before the war transformed him into a man in uniform. Karl Plagge was born in 1897 in Darmstadt, an industrial city in southwestern Germany, known for its chemical plants and engineering firms. He grew up in a middle-class household where education was valued and where the ideals of the Enlightenment, reason, progress, humanistic values, still held sway before the cataclysm of the First World War shattered the old certainties of European civilization. His father was a businessman, practical and methodical. His mother came from a family of educators. Plagge inherited both traits, the engineer's precision and the teacher's concern for the welfare of others. He was drafted into the German army in 1917, assigned to an artillery unit, and sent to the Western Front in the final, desperate year of the war. He witnessed the slaughter at Verdun, the mechanical horror of modern warfare, the senseless waste of human life ground into the mud of France. He was awarded the Iron Cross for bravery, though he rarely spoke of it afterward. The war did not make him a militarist. It made him a humanist. He returned to Germany in 1918 with a profound distrust of nationalist mythology and a deep skepticism toward authority that claimed to know absolute truths worth dying for. In the chaos of the Weimar Republic, Plagge pursued an engineering degree, specializing in mechanical systems and industrial management. He was drawn to the practical application of technology to improve human life, infrastructure, public works, systems that functioned efficiently and served a clear purpose. He married, started a family, and worked for various engineering firms through the turbulent 1920s. Germany was struggling, economically devastated by war reparations, politically fractured between extremists on the left and right, culturally adrift in the wreckage of the old imperial order. Like millions of Germans, Plagge watched as the democratic experiment of Weimar staggered from crisis to crisis, unable to provide stability or hope. And then came the promises, the speeches, the parades. The National Socialist German Workers' Party offered Germans what they desperately wanted: order, purpose, national rejuvenation, a sense that Germany would rise again from humiliation. Karl Plagge, like millions of educated, middle-class Germans who should have known better, joined the Nazi Party in 1931. He was not an ideologue. He did not attend rallies with fervent enthusiasm or devour copies of Mein Kampf with religious devotion. He joined because he believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that the Nazis represented a return to German efficiency, to rational administration, to economic recovery. He saw what he wanted to see, and ignored what was inconvenient to acknowledge. The anti-Semitic rhetoric, he told himself, was political theatre, campaign exaggeration that would moderate once the party assumed power. The threats against minorities were bluster, not policy. Germany needed order, and the Nazis promised order. That was enough, or so he convinced himself. By 1939, Karl Plagge had a successful career, a family, and a Nazi Party membership card that would prove useful in navigating the bureaucracy of the Third Reich. When war came in September, he was called up as a reserve officer and assigned to engineering and logistics units supporting the Wehrmacht's rapid advance into Poland. He was middle-aged, trained as an engineer, experienced in management, exactly the kind of officer needed to keep supply lines functioning and infrastructure operational in occupied territories. He was not a frontline combat soldier. He was an administrator, a manager of resources, a man who ensured that vehicles ran and buildings had electricity and work camps produced what the Reich required. It was in this capacity, as an officer responsible for managing labour and resources, that Karl Plagge found himself stationed in Vilnius, Lithuania, in 1941, after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Vilnius, the city once known as the Jerusalem of the North, home to one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in Europe, a city where Jewish culture had flourished for centuries, where Yiddish literature and scholarship had produced some of the greatest minds of the 20th century, a city that the Einsatzgruppen would turn into a graveyard. By the time Plagge arrived in Vilnius in late 1941, the systematic murder of Lithuanian Jews was already well underway. The Ponary massacre had begun in July. German SS units, supported by Lithuanian collaborators, were marching Jews into the Ponary forest on the outskirts of the city and shooting them in prepared pits, thousands at a time, men, women, children. By December, over 30,000 Jews from Vilnius had been murdered at Ponary. The remaining Jewish population, approximately 20,000 people, had been forced into 2 ghettos, sealed off from the rest of the city, starved, brutalized, and marked for eventual extermination. Karl Plagge was assigned as the commander of HKP 5 of 62, a vehicle repair workshop operated by the Wehrmacht's Heeres Kraftfahrpark, the Army Motor Vehicle Park. The workshop repaired trucks, cars, and military vehicles for German forces operating on the Eastern Front. It was unglamorous work, far from the drama of combat, but essential to the logistics that kept the German war machine functioning. The workshop required labourers, skilled mechanics, welders, carpenters, electricians. In the logic of the occupation, that meant Jewish forced labour drawn from the Vilnius Ghetto. Plagge was authorised to requisition as many workers as he needed, provided they were classified as essential to the German war effort. And here is where Karl Plagge began his deception. He requested permission to expand his labour force. Not just a few dozen mechanics, he needed hundreds of workers. In fact, he claimed the workshop required such specialised skills that entire families should be housed near the site to ensure maximum productivity. Workers performed better, he argued in his reports, when they were not separated from their families, when they had adequate food and shelter, when they were treated, within the constraints of occupation policy, with a modicum of basic dignity. He needed engineers, yes, but he also needed support staff. Cooks to feed the workers, teachers to maintain morale, elderly advisors whose experience was invaluable. Children, because workers were more productive when their families were safe. The requests were absurd. A vehicle repair workshop did not need teachers. It did not need children. But Plagge wrote his reports in the dense, bureaucratic language of military requisitions, and he'd learned something crucial about the Nazi system. It was possible to manipulate it if you understood its internal logic. The system valued efficiency, productivity, and proper documentation. If the paperwork was correct, if the justification sounded plausible, if a German officer with an Iron Cross and a party membership vouched for the necessity, then the system would authorize almost anything. The machinery of genocide was vast, but it was also chaotic, competing factions and jurisdictions, overlapping authorities who often cared more about their own prerogatives than about scrutinizing every detail of a labour requisition from a vehicle workshop in occupied Lithuania. Plagge's labour camp at HKP 562 grew. By 1943 it housed over 250 people, men, women, children, elderly, infants. They lived in converted barracks near the workshop. They received food rations that, while meagre, were significantly better than what was available in the ghettos. They were issued work permits that classified them as essential workers, a designation that, in theory, protected them from the periodic Aktionen, the roundups and selections in which the SS would sweep through the ghettos and deport thousands to their deaths. Plagge personally intervened on multiple occasions to retrieve workers who had been seized by SS units, waiving documentation and invoking Wehrmacht authority to demand their return. He argued, cajoled, threatened and lied, always couched in the language of military necessity, always claiming that the loss of these particular workers would harm the German war effort. The Jews under Plagge's protection understood, gradually and then with certainty, that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This German officer was risking his life to save theirs. He never spoke openly about his intentions. To do so would have been suicidal. But he found ways to communicate. He warned them, in coded language, when SS raids were imminent. He allowed smuggled food and medicine to enter the camp without punishment. He turned a blind eye to the small acts of resistance and mutual aid that allowed people to retain their humanity in the midst of horror. He treated them not as subhuman labour units, but as people. He learned their names. He inquired about their families. He attended to the small details that signalled respect, ensuring that religious holidays could be quietly observed, that children could receive rudimentary education, that the elderly were not worked to death. And most crucially, he lied. He lied in every report, every requisition, every interaction with SS officers and Nazi bureaucrats. He lied about the skills of his workers. He lied about the productivity of the workshop. He lied about the necessity of retaining every single person under his command. He lied with such consistency, such bureaucratic precision, such convincing sincerity, that for nearly 3 years he succeeded in keeping more than 1,000 people alive in a region where Jews were being systematically exterminated. Karl Plagge was not naive. He knew that his deception could not last forever. By 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Germany. The Red Army was advancing westward, pushing German forces back toward the Reich's pre-war borders. Vilnius would eventually be liberated, and when that happened, the Germans would retreat, and they would liquidate the labour camps as they went. The SS had standing orders to leave no Jewish witnesses alive. Every camp, every ghetto, every forced labour site would be emptied, and its inhabitants murdered before the Soviets arrived. This was not speculation. This was explicit policy. Karl Plagge had seen the directives. In June 1944, as Soviet forces approached Vilnius, Plagge received orders to prepare for evacuation. HKP 562 would be dismantled. The workshop would be moved westward, away from the advancing front. And the Jewish workers, they would be resettled. Everyone knew what that meant. Resettlement was the euphemism the Nazis used for deportation to death camps, for mass executions in the forests, for the final liquidation of Jewish labour forces that were no longer needed. Plagge faced an impossible choice. He could obey orders and preside over the murder of the people he had spent 3 years protecting. Or he could resist and face execution himself. There was no third option. The Wehrmacht had no tolerance for officers who disobeyed direct orders regarding Jewish labour. refusal would be classified as treason, punishable by immediate court-martial and death. Plagge had children, a wife, a life waiting for him in Germany if he survived the war. He had every personal reason to look away, to tell himself that he had done what he could, that he had saved these people for 3 years, and that was more than most German officers had done, that continuing to resist now would be pointless martyrdom. But Karl Plagge did not look away. On July 1st, 1944, 3 days before the final evacuation of HKP 562, Plagge did something extraordinary. He assembled all the Jewish workers in the camp and gave a speech. The speech was carefully worded, spoken in German and translated into Yiddish and Polish. On the surface, it was a standard address about the coming evacuation, about the importance of remaining calm and following instructions. But embedded within the speech were warnings, coded but unmistakable. Plagge spoke about the difficulties of the coming days. He mentioned that the workshop would be relocated, but he emphasized, with deliberate pauses and significant looks, that workers should consider their safety carefully. He spoke of the uncertainties of wartime evacuation, of the dangers that might be encountered on the roads. He said, and survivors would later testify to the exact phrasing, that he could no longer guarantee their protection once the camp was dissolved. It was the most he could say without openly inciting rebellion. But the message was clear. Hide. Do not board the trucks. Do not go with the SS. The evacuation is a death sentence. Find somewhere to hide until the Soviets arrive. The next day, July 2nd, 1944, SS units arrived at HKP 562 to oversee the liquidation. Plagge was ordered to assist in assembling the workers for transport. He complied, mechanically, his face expressionless. But he had already done what he could. Many of the workers, having understood his warning, had hidden themselves in bunkers and concealed spaces throughout the camp. When the SS began their sweep, they found hundreds missing. They searched, but time was short. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. The Germans did not have the luxury of a prolonged hunt. They rounded up as many Jews as they could find, approximately 250 people, loaded them onto trucks, drove them to Ponary, and shot them. But over 200 had hidden successfully, remaining concealed in the camp until the SS departed. On July 13, 1944, Soviet forces liberated Vilnius. The survivors of HKP 562 emerged from their hiding places, emaciated, traumatized, but alive. Karl Plagge had saved them. Not all of them. He could not save everyone. But over 200 men, women and children who should have died lived because a German officer had refused orders, had risked his life, and had found a way to warn them at the final moment. Karl Plagge did not wait to be thanked. He retreated westward with the German army, back into the collapsing Reich, back into the chaos of a losing war. He disappeared into the anonymity of millions of defeated soldiers. The final months of World War II were a descent into hell for Germany. By early 1945, the Third Reich was being crushed between the Soviet advance from the east and the Allied advance from the west. German cities were being reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Refugees flooded westward, fleeing the Red Army. The Nazi regime, cornered and desperate, became even more brutal, executing defeatists and traitors in spasms of final, futile violence. The SS and Gestapo roamed behind German lines, hanging deserters from lampposts, shooting officers suspected of disloyalty, enforcing a regime of terror even as the Reich disintegrated. Karl Plagge, now in Western Germany, tried to remain invisible. But his record had caught up with him. Someone, a rival officer, an SS functionary, perhaps someone who had heard rumours about his lenient treatment of Jewish workers, had filed reports. The accusations were vague but damning. Dereliction of duty, failure to implement security measures, suspicion of Jewish sympathies. In the paranoid atmosphere of the dying Reich, such accusations were enough. In March 1945, Karl Plagge was arrested by the Gestapo. There was no formal trial. Trials required time, and the Reich had none left. Plagge was held in military detention, interrogated and found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer. The sentence was death by firing squad. The execution was scheduled for April, but before it could be carried out, the war ended. American forces overran the detention facility in late April 1945, liberating prisoners and disarming guards. Karl Plagge, half-starved and awaiting execution, was freed by the same Allied armies that had destroyed the regime he had once joined. He returned to Darmstadt, to a Germany that no longer existed. The cities were ruins. The economy was shattered. The population was traumatized, hungry, and leaderless. Millions of Germans were undergoing denazification proceedings, interrogated by Allied authorities about their activities during the war. Plagge, like all former Nazi Party members, was investigated. He testified truthfully about his service, about his command of HKP 562, about the labour camp. But he did not speak of his deception. He did not claim credit for saving lives. He answered questions simply, factually, and then returned to his family and tried to rebuild a life in the wreckage. For years, Karl Plagge lived quietly. He worked as an engineer, avoided public attention, and carried the weight of what he had witnessed in silence. He did not seek recognition. He did not write memoirs. He did not speak of the war. He was, by all outward appearances, simply another former Wehrmacht officer trying to move forward in post-war Germany, indistinguishable from millions of others. But the survivors of HKP 562 had not forgotten. In the decades after the war, a small group of survivors, scattered across Israel, the United States, South America, began searching for the German officer who had saved them. They had fragments of memory, a name, a face, a voice speaking carefully chosen words in July 1944. They wrote letters to German authorities, to Jewish organizations, to anyone who might help locate Major Karl Plagge of Darmstadt. The search took years. Many survivors had died. Addresses were outdated, bureaucracies were slow. But they persisted, driven by the conviction that the world needed to know what one man had done. In 1957, a group of survivors located Karl Plagge. They invited him to testify on their behalf in legal proceedings related to war crimes trials. Plagge agreed. He travelled to Germany's legal offices and gave detailed testimony about the conditions in Vilnius, about the actions of SS units, about the murder of Lithuanian Jews. But even then he did not emphasise his own role. He spoke as a witness, not as a hero. He described what he had seen and what he had done in flat, factual terms, without embellishment or self-justification. The survivors, however, spoke for him. They testified that Karl Plagge had saved their lives. They provided affidavits, signed statements, detailed accounts of his interventions. They described how he had warned them, how he had protected them, how he had risked execution to keep them alive. In 1965, after years of investigation and testimony, Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to victims of the Holocaust, honoured Karl Plagge with the title of Righteous Among the Nations, a designation reserved for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Karl Plagge received the honour with characteristic modesty. He did not attend the ceremony in Jerusalem, he did not give speeches. He simply sent a letter thanking the survivors for their recognition, and stating that he had done only what any decent person should have done. He died in 1957, before the full extent of his actions became widely known. But the story did not end with his death. Survivors continued to speak. Historians researched. Documents were uncovered. And gradually, the full scope of what Karl Plagge had accomplished became clear. He had not saved just a few dozen people. The ripple effects of his actions had been profound. The survivors of HKP 562 had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Families that should have been annihilated continued. By conservative estimates, Karl Plagge's deception, his refusal to obey orders, had resulted in the survival of more than 1,000 people, and the existence of thousands more descendants who would never have been born if he had remained silent. There is a temptation, when we tell stories of resistance during the Holocaust, to portray the rescuers as saints, as people so morally exceptional that their actions seem impossible to emulate. We place them on pedestals beyond the reach of ordinary humanity, and in doing so, we absolve ourselves of responsibility. We tell ourselves that we could never be so brave, so selfless, so willing to sacrifice. We make heroism into something mythical, untouchable, rare. But Karl Plagge was not a saint. He was a middle-aged engineer from an ordinary German city who made ordinary mistakes, who joined the Nazi Party out of a mixture of misguided hope and self-interested calculation, who spent the first years of the war doing unremarkable administrative work for a criminal regime. He did not begin the war as a hero. He began it as a man complicit in atrocity by association, a man who wore the uniform and carried the party card and facilitated through his competent efficiency the machinery of occupation. What made Karl Plagge extraordinary was not that he was morally superior from the beginning. What made him extraordinary was that he changed. At some point in 1941 or 1942, confronted with the reality of what the Nazi regime was doing to human beings, Karl Plagge made a choice. He could continue to obey, to rationalize, to tell himself that he was just following orders and that his individual actions did not matter. Or he could resist, even if that resistance was incomplete, even if it could only save some and not all, even if it would cost him his life. He chose resistance. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small acts of deception, in bureaucratic lies and falsified reports, in warnings delivered in careful code, in the relentless, exhausting effort to protect people whom the state had declared expendable. He resisted with the tools available to him: paperwork, administrative authority, the chaotic jurisdictional rivalries of the Nazi system. He resisted knowing that he could be discovered at any time, that his deception could collapse, that the penalty for what he was doing was death. And he was not alone. Scattered across occupied Europe were other German officers, other bureaucrats, other ordinary people who made similar choices: Oskar Schindler, Wilm Hosenfeld, Albert Battle, Anton Schmid, men who held German uniforms and Nazi credentials, and who used their positions to save lives. They were not numerous, they were not the majority, but they existed, and their existence proved something crucial. Even within the most totalitarian, most ideologically poisonous system, individual moral choice remains possible. Even when the state demands complicity and atrocity, individuals can refuse. The refusal may be quiet, hidden, wrapped in lies and subterfuge, but it is refusal nonetheless, and it matters. Karl Plagge's resistance also reveals something about the nature of genocide. The Holocaust was not carried out by a small cadre of fanatical killers. It required the participation, active or passive, of millions of people: soldiers, bureaucrats, railway workers, factory managers, ordinary citizens who looked the other way, who followed orders, who told themselves that they had no choice. The machinery of genocide functioned because most people obeyed. But the existence of people like Karl Plagge demonstrates that obedience was not inevitable. At every level of the system, choices were being made. People chose to obey, chose to participate, chose to prioritize their own safety and careers over the lives of the victims, and a very few, chose otherwise. This is not to minimize the courage required. Resistance under totalitarian conditions demands a kind of bravery that is almost unbearable. Karl Plagge lived for 3 years under the constant threat of discovery, knowing that a single suspicious report, a single investigation, a single moment of bad luck could result in his execution. He watched people die whom he could not save. He lived with the knowledge that his deception, no matter how skillful, could only delay the inevitable for a finite time. He endured the moral weight of partial success, of saving some but not all, of knowing that even his best efforts could not prevent the murder of millions. And yet he persisted, not because he expected gratitude, not because he anticipated recognition, but because he believed, had to believe, that every life saved mattered, that every day of survival granted to another human being was a victory against the machinery of death, however small, however temporary. Among the survivors of HKP 562, one object became symbolic of Karl Plagge's protection: the work permit. A small piece of paper, stamped with official seals, bearing the inscription HKP 562 and the signature of Major Karl Plagge. In the hellish logic of the Nazi occupation, this piece of paper meant the difference between life and death. Jews who possessed it were classified as essential workers, theoretically protected from deportation. Jews without it were vulnerable to every action, every roundup, every selection. The work permits were precious beyond measure. Families guarded them with desperate care, keeping them dry, keeping them safe, ready to present them at any checkpoint or inspection. Children too young to work carried permits that Plagge had issued on fabricated pretenses, claiming they were apprentices or assistants. Elderly men and women, barely able to stand, carried permits listing them as skilled craftsmen. The permits were lies, and everyone knew they were lies, but they were lies that kept people alive. But the permits had power only because Karl Plagge defended them. Numerous times, SS officers challenged the validity of the documents, arguing that certain workers were clearly not essential, that children and elderly people served no productive purpose, that the entire HKP 562 camp was obviously a cover for harbouring Jews, and every time Plagge intervened, he produced additional paperwork, he cited Wehrmacht regulations, he invoked his authority as a major and his record as a decorated officer. He lied with absolute conviction, and he made the lies stick. The work permits became more than just documents. They became symbols of the fragile barrier between survival and annihilation, symbols of the power of one man's determination to subvert a genocidal system from within. After the war, survivors kept their permits, yellowed and worn, as sacred relics. They showed them to their children and grandchildren, explaining, "This piece of paper, this signature, this is why you exist. This is why your family was not erased from history." When Samuel Esterowicz, one of the survivors, testified at Karl Plagge's recognition ceremony in 1965, he held up his work permit and said, "This man saved my life not once, but every day for 3 years. Every morning I woke up in that camp, I was alive because Major Plagge had lied to the SS, had argued for my value, had insisted that I was necessary. He did this for me. He did this for more than 1,000 others. He did this knowing that if he was caught, he would die." The permit, a bureaucratic tool of oppression, had been transformed by Plagge into an instrument of resistance. It was a reminder that even within systems designed to facilitate atrocity, individuals could find ways to subvert, to deceive, to save lives. The permit was a lie that told the truth, that human decency could survive even in the heart of darkness. Karl Plagge did not speak much about his actions after the war. When asked why he had risked his life to save Jews, he gave simple, almost evasive answers. "I did what I could," he said. "It was not enough." He rejected the label of hero. He refused to be celebrated. He carried with him, until his death, the knowledge that he had saved some but not all, that hundreds had died despite his efforts, that he had been complicit, however unwillingly, in a regime responsible for the deaths of millions. This silence, this refusal to claim credit, is characteristic of many who resisted the Nazis. They did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as people who had done the bare minimum required by conscience, who had acted when action was still possible, who had refused to participate fully in atrocity. They carried guilt for what they had not prevented, grief for those they could not save, and a deep skepticism toward any narrative that lionized individual acts of resistance while the larger machinery of genocide had operated with such devastating efficiency. But the survivors did not allow Karl Plagge's story to remain silent. They spoke for him when he would not speak for himself. They testified to what he had done, not to elevate him above other rescuers, but to ensure that the world understood that resistance had been possible, that individuals had made choices, that even in the most totalitarian system, moral agency had not been entirely extinguished. Pearl Good, a survivor of HKP 562, wrote in her memoir, "Major Plagge gave us something more valuable than food or shelter. He gave us proof that not all Germans were murderers, that decency could exist even in the uniform of the Wehrmacht. In the darkest time of our lives, when we had every reason to believe that humanity itself had died, Karl Plagge showed us that it had not. For that, we could never thank him enough." In Jewish tradition, there is a teaching from the Talmud that appears in the Mishnah, a text compiled in the early centuries of the Common Era. Whoever saves a single life is considered as if they have saved the entire world. It is a teaching about the infinite value of the individual, about the moral weight of each human being, about the sacred responsibility to protect life. Karl Plagge saved more than one life. By the most conservative estimates, over 200 people survived the war because of his direct intervention. If we count the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those survivors, the generations that would never have existed if Plagge had obeyed orders, the number extends into the thousands. Entire family trees, entire lineages of human experience, joy, suffering, creativity, love. All of it exists because a middle-aged German engineer decided in 1942 that he would lie to the SS. But the significance of Karl Plagge's actions extends beyond the arithmetic of lives saved. His story stands as evidence that moral choice remained possible even in the heart of totalitarian darkness, that individuals could resist even when resistance seemed futile, that bureaucratic systems designed to facilitate genocide could be subverted by determined people with access to the levers of power. Plagge's deception was not a dramatic act of sabotage or violent resistance. It was quieter, more patient, more carefully calculated, but no less courageous for that. He used paperwork as a weapon, lies as a shield, and administrative authority as a tool of rescue. He demonstrated that resistance does not always require heroic gestures or martyrdom. Sometimes it requires something even more difficult, the relentless, exhausting work of deceiving evil, day after day, for years, with no guarantee of success. Karl Plagge also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about complicity and redemption. He was a Nazi Party member. He wore the uniform of the Wehrmacht. He served the Third Reich for years before he began his resistance. In the moral landscape of the Holocaust, he exists in a complex, ambiguous space, neither wholly innocent nor wholly guilty, neither entirely complicit nor entirely redeemed. His story resists simple categorization. It demands that we acknowledge the possibility of moral transformation, even for those who began on the wrong side, even for those who participated in the machinery of atrocity before they chose to resist. This does not excuse his initial participation. It does not erase the fact that he joined the Nazi Party voluntarily, that he served the regime, that his actions as an officer contributed to the German war effort. But it complicates the narrative. It suggests that people are capable of change, that moral awakening can occur even in the midst of genocide, that individuals who made terrible choices can, under certain circumstances, make better ones. The story of Karl Plagge is a reminder that history is made not only by vast impersonal forces, ideologies, economics, military strategies, but also by individual human decisions made in moments of moral clarity or confusion, courage or cowardice, selflessness or self-preservation. The Holocaust was carried out by people who chose to obey, who chose to look away, who chose to prioritize their own survival over the lives of the victims, and it was resisted, however inadequately, by people who chose otherwise. Karl Plagge was one of those people. He made a choice. He paid a price. And because of that choice, thousands of lives continue, echoing forward through generations, a testament to the enduring power of individual conscience against the machinery of death. In the end, Karl Plagge's legacy is not written in monuments or memorials, but in the existence of families who should not exist, in the children and grandchildren of survivors who carry within them the genetic inheritance of people marked for extinction. Every one of them is proof that resistance mattered, that individual action mattered, that one man's refusal to obey orders, his willingness to deceive, to risk, to lie in the service of truth, changed the course of history in ways both immeasurable and profound. On a cold January evening in 1942, Karl Plagge signed his name to a document that authorized a lie. He did not know, in that moment, whether his deception would succeed, whether anyone would survive, whether his actions would mean anything at all in the vast machinery of genocide. He knew only that he would try, that he would resist, that he would save whom he could for as long as he could. And in the end, that was enough. Not to stop the Holocaust, not to prevent the murder of millions, but enough to ensure that some survived, that some families continued, that some light persisted in the darkness. Enough to prove that even when the world descends into madness, even when evil operates with bureaucratic efficiency and totalitarian power, individual conscience remains. It remains quiet, hidden, fragile, but it remains. And sometimes in the right hands it is enough to save the world,